was in love with Rachel and said, I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. Now, let me explain to you the story of Jacob, okay? Jacob is in love with 2 women. Well, he's in love with one, Rachel, right? The one woman that he's in love with is Rachel, okay? I want to explain this to you so that you have a better understanding of what's coming. Jacob is in love with Rachel. He says to his father-in-law, I'm going to work 7 years for you so that I can have Rachel as my wife. He works the full 7 years. When the 7 years are done with, the father doesn't give him Rachel. The father gives him his other daughter, Leah. And Leah goes in the tent. He wakes up in the morning and he's lying with the wrong woman. So he goes and says to the father, why did you trick me? He said, I worked 7 years for Rachel. Why did you give me Leah? And he says, it is not proper to marry the younger daughter before the older daughter. But if you work for me another 7 years, I will also give you Rachel. Okay? But he said, before you begin your work, make sure you give Leah her 7 days of celebration. So, in the whole process of all of this, now he has one wife, and he won't get the next wife till when? 7 years later. You understand? So, now if you talk about Ramez's knowledge, you're talking about this scripture is prophesying to you a future time, a future event where 2 marriages are going to take place. Okay? So, the wife that gets married first is Leah. Now, as Leah begins having children, if you count all of her children in this chapter, before it's over with, Leah has 7 children. When you go to the book of Revelation, there are 7 churches. Understand? So there are 7 churches. Rachel is the first one to get married, and she just happens to have 7 children. So you see how we're comparing scripture to scriptures? But what if Rachel is representing the Gentile church? That means God is prophesying to you and saying that there is going to be a woman who is going to be married, and she's going to produce 7 children. How many of you know that you are the bride of Christ? How many of you know that as God's bride, the bride of Christ is producing 7 churches, 7 children, just as Leah. But now, 7 years later, Jacob also marries Rachel, who only has a couple of children, right? So now you're seeing the comparison. In the future, God is saying there's going to be 2 marriages. First, the marriage of Christ to the church. After he takes the church out of the world and there's a marriage to God, or marriage to Jesus Christ, now, how long does the tribulation last? 7 years. 7 years later, the Lord comes back, rescues Israel, and now he also marries Israel, who is Rachel. Because remember, he loved Israel before he loved the Gentile church. You understand? And that's what God is doing. He's prophesying you, but in a way of Ramez. What Ramez is what? Now I'm comparing scripture to scripture, and I'm also prophesying about the future in those scriptures. So in the future, there will be 2 marriages. One to a Gentile bride, and one to a Jewish bride. Okay? And the Gentile bride has 7 churches. In the book of Revelation, what are the churches? Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, right? The 7 churches. Now, let's go to the book of Genesis, chapter 41. We're in Genesis already. Let's go to chapter 41. We're going to tell you another story. In chapter 41, verse 26, Now this is what happens in this. Now let's talk about Joseph, okay? Joseph has 12 brothers, right? Joseph tells his 12 brothers, hey, I had a dream that one day all of you are going to bow down and worship me. All the 11 brothers get very upset at Joseph, right? So they get so upset at Joseph for saying, and then he also goes to his parents and says, oh, by the way, I had another dream, and my 11 brothers bow down and worship me, and you're going to bow down and worship me too. So the parents are like, okay, this kid's kind of out there. But the brothers are so upset that they take Joseph out and they start planning his death. They're like, no, we're going to kill this guy. So they take Joseph and they put Joseph, they put him in a hole. He remains in this hole, but only after they sold him for 20 pieces of silver. You understand? Now, do we know of a group of people that killed their own brother and sold him for 30 pieces or silver? It's the Jewish people, right? Now, the brother who sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, or the Egyptians, who sold his brother to the Egyptians, his name was Judas. Okay? The Jewish guy who sold Jesus to the Romans is Judas. But they both sold him for 30 pieces of silver and 20 pieces of silver. So Joseph is now really showing you the future of what's going to happen to Jesus. He's going to be betrayed. He's going to be thrown in a hole. 3 days later, he's going to come out of the hole. And when he came out of the hole, he went to Egypt, right? You guys know the story of Joseph? Joseph went to Egypt. You know what happened to Joseph in Egypt? He became number 2 in command of all of Egypt. Okay? Now, in this scripture, the king has a dream. And he says, in this dream, I dreamed of 7 scrawny cows and 7 healthy cows. And Joseph wants to tell him, look, he says in verse 26, the 7 good cows are 7 years. And the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up after are the 7 years. And so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. Okay? So Joseph is interpreting the dream for the king. Joseph tells the king, we're going to have 7 good years, but then we're going to have 7 really bad years of famine. Okay? There's going to be no food in the land. So let's store up the food so that when the 7 years of famine come, that we're prepared for it. The king loves Joseph so much, he says, I want to give you my daughter. Now Joseph is Jewish. The king's daughter is a Gentile. So Joseph marries this Gentile bride, right? So Joseph is living where? In the palace, right? With his Gentile bride. When the famine hits for 7 years, you know who's starving? The Jewish people back in Israel are starving. But Joseph and his bride are living very well in the palace, right? So Joseph marries a Gentile bride. They're living in the palace while the Jewish people are starving for 7 years of famine. So now, when Christ, who was also sold for silver, okay, thrown in a hole, he's in heaven at the right hand of the Father, right? Now, he is in command, okay? He is in command. But there's going to be a 7 years of famine that's going to happen in the world, which is the tribulation.